Okay, cool. So I'm just going to do what I'm calling a brief case study on reusability with Interface Builder. I'm not trying to talk broadly about reusability. I just want to kind of share a particular situation that I had, a very simple case, and talk about some of the trade-offs and different approaches to reusability. So um, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ben DiFrancesco. This is where you can find me on the internet. I'm an independent consultant or contractor, whatever you want to call it, and my consultancy is called ScopeLift. So basically, the talk is about how you would implement this design. Really simple design. This is kind of a sanitized version of a real design that I got in a project. It's kind of like a custom share sheet. It takes the whole screen. You have four social networks, their icons, a little header above, next to each, and then a little description about what it means to share this piece of content from the app on that social network in particular. And when I saw this design, it's obviously very simple, but it had just enough repetition to make me pause and think about what the right way to implement this would be in Interface Builder with a storyboard. So, four options that I can think of at least. One would be to use a table view. Another would be to use container views with a single child view controller. Another option would be to use reusable nibs or zibs or whatever you want to call them. And the fourth option would be to just straight up do static layout, to just lay the view out the way that it appears and configure everything right in Interface Builder. So when I first saw this and started thinking about it, my initial reaction was that a table view would probably be way overkill for what we were doing here. But also my initial reaction was that static layout wasn't the right way to go because clearly there's similarities between each of the panes for each social network. So you don't want to be doing the same layout 4 different times. You don't want to have to change something multiple times. So maybe one of these options in the middle is a good compromise between a table view and a static layout. What I want to do quickly, not going to understand everything, but is I want to look at each implementation really fast. Just going to go through it quickly. I don't expect everyone to read all of the code or anything, but just look at some of the trade-offs between each of the implementations and decide on what one is actually the best way to go. So let's see if I can hop back to Xcode. So the app, just real quick, does work. It's super boring. There's 4 implementations of the same thing. They're basically all the same, a little bit different because I was sloppy, and they work. So if you click on one, it shares it, and it shows you which social network you shared it on, and that's literally it. So, but the key is to understand, what is the difference between getting to that point with the implementation and done these 4 different ways. So looking quickly at the table view, the storyboard is unsurprising. It's like most table views. You have a header, you have a single prototype cell that is configured generally. And so since we have this prototype cell, the first thing that you realize is that you need some kind of abstraction that will configure the generic cell to each specific case according to the four different social networks that you want to appear on this view, right? And so in the case of the table view, what the implementation ends up looking like, well, first of all, to generalize that, or to abstract over that configuration, I used an enum, and that enumeration is backed by an integer. And so it represents the index in the table view that each pane, I'm going to call it, would have. So then I used a view model that takes that enum and just configures some properties, a header, a message, the icon, and the background color for the icon for each of the 4 different cases. So then in your table view implementation, in the actual table view controller, kind of looks like every table view controller, which is to say a mess. You have your data source and your delegate implementations. You have to provide the cell, and so we configure the cell with the view model. Again, we drive that view model with an enum that is instantiated with the raw value of the index path that in the table view that we're at. And of course, you also have to respond to that. So in your did select row at index path, you're going to take whichever action is appropriate for each social network. So kind of as you expected, I mean, just this bare bones implementation, using a dynamic table view for 4 static cells is not really a good idea. This is like way overkill and pretty unnecessary. We've introduced a lot of stuff. So The pro is that you only lay the cell out once. That's good. But the cons are you have a big, ugly view controller, lots of indirection via delegation, custom UI table view cell implementation, which I didn't even show you. But basically, all that does is consume the view model and configure the views. So, you know, a lot going on just to show 4 things. So how about containers using a UI container view? This one actually, as you would expect, is a lot cleaner. So you basically have a single view controller with 4 container views. Those 4 container views each have an embed segue to the same child view controller over here. So in this case, you have the same problem where you have you have the same benefit and problem where you have a general configuration of the layout for the pane, but you now have to somehow provide the configuration for that pane. So with the table view, it was the index path. And in this case, again, I reused the same view model and the same enum, but it's driven instead by the segue identifier that each embed segue has to the same child view controller. So in your parent view controller, the implementation basically is just the prepare for segue method, where you have to get a hold of the child view controller. You have to inspect what segue identifier you're using, and then you have to pass a view model into your new embed segue view controller that you're creating here, your child view controller, to configure that, and also an action handler. So the child or container view controller basically just knows how to configure itself with the view model and how to react to that action when the user taps on that pane. And I'm just using an invisible, a clear UI button laying over the entire pane to handle the action. So this is definitely cleaner. It doesn't seem too bad, but don't forget, we still have the enum, we still have the view model. We now have 2 view controllers. So again, hopping back to the cons here, 2 view controllers, all the other abstraction that we talked about before, and this kind of segue-driven behavior where we're inspecting what the name of our embed segue is, which to me just feels like a little bit yucky, although certainly is often necessary. So what if we did a throwback and used nibs? So again, the pro here is that we're only doing the layout once, but we still have a lot of the same trade-offs or problems that we had before. So looking at our storyboard for the nib implementation, this one looks kind of simple. So we actually get to see what each of these is loading the view from the nib. And I actually used, I pulled in a third-party dependency that Tom Pirulia mentioned, which is called nib designable. That actually, so that's over here. Yikes. So it actually uses IB designable, and you inherit from this nib designable view with your custom view implementation. And with IB designable, it then loads things up in Interface Builder, so you actually get a preview. If you've used nibs in order to reuse controls with Interface Builder before, you know that normally you just drag out a plain UI view and it just sits there and looks empty. And of course you connect it to the custom view that you've implemented, but you don't see that until you run it on the device. So that's kind of a trade-off. But in this case, we get that around that a little bit. We see a general configuration for what each one looks like. And of course, again, we have the same issue that we had before, where we have to configure the cell, and we again use the view model to do that. And we still have to, in this case, we also have to react to, in all the cases, we have to react to the user action. But in this case, the action is going to be trapped by a custom view implementation. So I'll jump to that right here. Here's the share pane. Oh, real quickly, here's the zib. Again, obviously you're only implementing the layout once. That's good. But here is the custom view. And we don't want a view handling or responding to a user action, taking some kind of action going out to the network to do the sharing or whatever. So the view has to pass that back to the view controller. The way that I chose to do that was to implement a delegate. So in this class, I've also defined a protocol for a share pane delegate, and then my implementation of the view controller here implements that protocol, handles it, and reaches out to the share controller, which is just the thing that's popping up the view controller, the alert view controller. But in a normal implementation, would be taking whatever action was needed. So. This one I don't think is any cleaner than the UI container view. If you weren't convinced the UI container view is good, I don't think you're convinced that this is the right way to go. So we have a delegation. In this case, we, again, pro, only do the layout once, but the cons are that it requires a custom view, delegation. You need kind of like the magic, I call it magic incantations to get the nibs to load properly with the storyboards. Like if you've ever done that, it's kind of this dance with, I set the file's owner and then I do something in the initter, I don't ever remember what it is, and it's kind of a pain. And then you either get a blank storyboard or lots of code to make IB designable work, or you have to pull in a dependency to make IB designable work. I did the last option, but actually there's always trade-offs with pulling in dependencies. In this case, because I was in Swift 2, a bunch of stuff was broken that I had to change to before it would work or compile. So trade-offs. The last option that originally I thought was not a good option was to just freaking lay the stuff out in Interface Builder the way that it was supposed to look. Just do a static layout in the storyboard. My initial reaction was not to do this, but when you do it, here's what you find. So first of all, the storyboard looks the way that it's going to look when the user loads the view up. Of course, it doesn't have the same size. That's to be expected. That's kind of the point. But otherwise, it looks the way that it is supposed to look. Also, when you look at the implementation of the view controller, it's dead simple. It's 4 action handlers that we target action, and we've wired them up via Interface Builder. And then we're just passing the message along to our share controller, which does whatever work it does. So at the end of the day, when I looked at this, this was actually the cleanest implementation of all of them. So what are the pros and the cons? The storyboard reflects the final view. There's all those abstractions that we talked about before, the enum, the view model, something that consumed the view model and configured the view, all of those go away. Our view controller is virtually empty. It's dead simple to reason about and easy to maintain from the perspective of even a beginner in iOS development. If they've had any experience with iOS development at all, if asked to make a change to this view, is going to be able to open that up and make a change without any problems. So the cons, of course, is what we were trying to avoid the whole time, which is that we've duplicated the layout of each share view. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about 4 static cells, is it really so bad to have to go change something 4 times? And in fact, if you are a little bit careful about the way that you do the layout, even that isn't so bad. So say that someone came to me and said, we want to change the size of the icons. You actually don't even have to do that 4 times if you've treated this first pane kind of as a master and laid whatever was possible out in accordance with that. So say that you wanted to make this smaller or bigger or whatever, you could pop in here and do that, and the rest of your views would react and do the right thing. Same thing with, say, let's increase the space, the padding between the icon and the text. Again, very easy to do and only requires 1 change if you can find the constraint, which is one problem, I admit. But again, actually not that tough to do if your layout is smart. So certainly there are things that if you needed to change it, you would have to change it 4 times. But in my opinion, static layout in this case was the clear winner for reasons of simplicity and maintainability. Having to repeat some changes in Interface Builder multiple times and do some additional layout at the outset is not a compelling enough reason to add otherwise unneeded abstractions and code. Doing some introspection, as a programmer, I may have been biased toward a code-based solution in the name of reusability or dryness in my storyboards, when really I just like to write code. And so that was why I was leaning that way. So as we do with all, this is a case study, but as we do with all case studies, I'm not going to overgeneralize about what we've learned. I think from this exercise, I think it might be good practice to favor static layout-based solutions until requirements truly drive something more reusable. What would those requirements be? I think some obvious cases are very large data sets. Even if the data is static, like say coming out of a database that you're storing on the device every time and it's the same, obviously if there's dozens or hundreds or thousands of rows, you're going to need a table view controller or a collection view or something like that. Also dynamically sized data sets, if you don't know how many things you're going to get until you hit the network or do something else, clearly, again, you're going to need some kind of abstraction to deal with that. Otherwise, though, I think it's a good practice to start with a static layout and go from there. So disclaimer is that your mileage may vary. This is a case study. The details of your app and your processes around development could drive your decisions. That's it. I don't really think there's time for questions, but grab me at... Cool.
This guy.
Did you consider the static table view?
So a static table view doesn't really get you anything over just doing the static layout. You're still doing all the identical layout, and you still have to implement these kind of ugly delegate methods. At that point, again, I would just prefer the static layout and wire things up.
Yeah, if you have to add more rows, then you have to implement scrolling.
Yes. So well, actually, all the implementations that I did here are inside of a scroll view. So the static one does kind of scroll, and you kind of have, like, for something like this, you almost have to do that if you want it to look good on the 4S up to the 6 Plus. You know, you could lay it out to only to be exactly the correct size without a scroll view, but then things just get goofy with the text sizing and everything else. So they're all in a scroll view. It would be more difficult to add another pane the way that I've done it, but not that much more difficult, to be honest.
Did you look at UI stack view?
You know, I have not played with UI stack view at all yet. Do you think that would be a good solution here?
I don't know how it works in interface builder, but you can just like put a view inside of it. It'll just stack it.
That's pretty cool.
So you could reconfigure it.
And I have heard really good things about that API as well. So that maybe there'll be a follow-up where I tell you that actually just do it with stack view.
Stack views are amazing. I found a view that was like, I won't be able to do this. Done in with no auto layout.
Cool.
Internal. Yeah. No
All right.
auto layout for me. Thank you very much.